Well, good afternoon. First of all, I just want to thank Brian and Jeff for inviting me to be in this space. This is just as much of a blessing and honor for me to have this exchange, because hopefully that's what this is exchange, the opportunity for us to learn from one another and engage maybe in some questions that we don't necessarily grapple with on an everyday basis, but want to be equipped to do that and to facilitate other people to grapple with those questions. What I've titled this talk is sort of this idea of, maybe we've come away from as a body of Christ, as a community, as a country, from this practice of being uncomfortable and the growth that comes from that. And so I'm hoping that today we can be uncomfortable, but be uncomfortable in love and be uncomfortable in grace, and hopefully grow in that space. So thank you guys for being here. And I got a few names beforehand, and I know I got a few locations. Anyone not from Texas? Awesome. So I heard California earlier. What other states are we coming from? Colorado. Cool. I was just in Denver. Cool city. West Virginia. Haven't been there.
I'm in Charleston, South Carolina.
Okay, cool. Anywhere else? We got the South covered. Maryland. Awesome. So, when Brian asked me to do this, obviously my context is Austin, but I think what we're seeing on a national level, on an international level, is that we are seeing some of the same patterns, right? Because when we think of institutional racism, institutional bias, and how it's pervasive in our communities, we're seeing those same things take place no matter what city we're in, what town we're in, regardless of the political climate of that space. And so hopefully we can use Austin as sort of the micro lens for today, and then you guys can take that to your individual spaces of influence and think about the macro approach. And so Brian told you a little bit about me, and hopefully this will help provide context for today's conversation. But yes, I am born and raised here in Austin, and given that we are one of the fastest growing cities in the country, that's a very rare thing to be, is a native Austinite. We call ourselves unicorns now, so you can tell all your friends and family you saw a unicorn this weekend. And even more unique than growing up in Austin is growing up in Austin and being African American. Austin is progressively becoming a city where we're seeing sort of disparate experiences, right? That of people with resources, that of people without. And that is closely aligned with our ethnic and racial or cultural sort of identity. And I'm sure that is not necessarily news or unique to your own experiences, maybe in some of the spaces you're coming from. And with that sort of experience in terms of the spaces I navigated as a child, both in the communities we lived in, the schools I attended, the schools I matriculated to for college and graduate school, in predominantly white spaces, still through this lens or being anchored by my real identity, which is that of a child of God. And understanding that maybe I was being placed in these unique spaces because I would learn not only how to navigate them, but hopefully learn how we could start to have conversations that bridged us on what our sort of unified identity is, which is that of people who love Christ. I'm also a PK. Any PKs in the house? Hey. I'm also a double PK. My father is a pastor, my mother is a pastor. They're both on staff at Agape Christian Ministries, which is a church in North Austin. My mom is a pastoral counselor. And so that definitely also for you PKs has a little bit of influence on your upbringing. And one of the things that I just felt really on my heart, particularly moving into my college experience, was having a firm understanding of the historical legacy of race in America. That it's not just around sort of cultural sort of practices, but it's policy related. It's pervasive in our systems. We can't necessarily detach ourselves economically, socially, in terms of our education, without having understanding of how racial identity and politics of race have played a part in that. And so having an understanding of that context and then moving back to Austin, it was like a light bulb. All the things I had sort of observed as a child, now having some tangible sense, having the rhetoric, the verbiage to put around that and say, okay, this is why I saw such a divide in this part of the city. This isn't just a heart issue, this is a policy issue, right? And so we're going to talk a little bit about both. As leaders in your community churches, how do we shape people's hearts, but also how do we equip them with practical knowledge, practical skills on how to confront these systemic issues that we're seeing in our communities. And so hopefully those are some of the things that we'll do today, and I hope you guys will join me. And then, as Brian alluded to, we're going to have a little bit of small group conversation around some of these conversations. You can start thinking about how these things play out in your local context. So we're going to start here with this quote. Human progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. Every step towards the goal of justice requires sacrifice, suffering, and the tireless exertions and passionate concern of dedicated individuals. So I can't necessarily conjure up sort of what Martin Luther King was thinking about when he wrote this quote, right? But what I would deduce is that given that the political, social context of that time, this is written in 1963, and the 2018, given our current political context, is that this wasn't sort of a pep talk. This was sort of an admonishment of America at the time. And I think what we can say on a micro lens is maybe an admonishment of what the church is doing or not doing in this current conversation. And basically what he's saying is that on this road to equity, on this road to equality, it's not something that happens automatically. It's not necessarily organic. It takes intentional practices. It takes sort of an examination of not only what we're doing as individuals, but what we're doing as the collective. Maybe the collective as a church, maybe the collective as a community, maybe the collective as the institutions that we partake in. And I think particularly given my lens here in Austin, one of the things that we're really trying to steward within context of this quote is this idea that it's not going to be comfortable, right? And not only not comfortable for ourselves, but maybe not comfortable for the people we're around. And what can we do as leaders to make sure that we're creating a space that people realize that comfortability isn't necessarily meaning that we are forsaking their safety or not doing this in love, but in fact, through love, we're helping them grow. And that it's going to take a lot more than just sort of idealism. It's going to take more than sort of liberal bumper stickers. It's going to take more than this idea of rah-rah in terms of response to crisis. This is going to take intentional, systematic, as well as ongoing efforts in the spaces that we're called to. So I wanted to walk you through a little bit around sort of the principles of, yes, we're talking about doing this within the four walls of the church, but also what is the role of our individual spaces, our individual congregations, to be a force outside those four walls. And so I wanted to start with sort of this idea of what does community mean? What is God calling us to be as community? I think a lot of us, we tend to define our community as those things that we have natural connection to. It's geographically maybe defined. It's defined by sort of identity and culture. But if we're truly being obedient to the Word of God, community is that of which God's called us to in that time, in that season. And that may mean coming outside of our comfort zone to meet the needs of that community. And so I'm a firm believer in this idea that in order for us to be fully equipped to do this work in a contemporary context, we have to have an understanding of our historical narrative. And so I behoove each of you guys to go back to your individual spaces and truly get an understanding of your cultural context. A lot of times we're trying to do this work, we're sort of with this idea of grasping at things we've heard, our own experiences, and we haven't done the due diligence, we haven't done the work to have an understanding of maybe what people are feeling, maybe the ways in which this particular space is interacting with individuals has something to do with the foundation. And what does it look like if once we've gotten a snapshot of that foundation, we bring that information and that context into our contemporary work? And so I'm going to walk you guys through a little bit of the history, the nuances around Austin. I think some of you guys did a little bit of a tour. Some of you guys are from the Austin area. But again, just to kind of give you a sense of what happens when we sort of operate out of what we think is the reality versus what is the reality. And so particularly in this context, this political context where we're seeing people who've historically been underserved, historically sort of marginalized, we're seeing this rapid deterioration of their ability to be included, to be embraced in the spaces that they're either being educated in or the workplace. And so when we acknowledge those challenges and we acknowledge sort of the foundational things that took place to get us where we are, we have a much better chance of addressing them. So this is Clarksville. If you can see in the background, you can see the capital. So Clarksville was one of the first freedmen towns in the state of Texas. So if you guys remember, we had the Emancipation, yay, thank you Abraham Lincoln, we're free. But a few states were a little slow on the uptake, Tennessee, Texas, Arkansas. So we were like, a year or two behind, still working on those plantations. And then when word was we were free, we created these freedmen towns. Well, the first freedmen town in Texas was right here in Austin. It was called Clarksville. And so if you're in West Austin, right off of Enfield, which predominantly now, if you drive around the neighborhood, you're saying, oh, this is a pretty well-to-do neighborhood. We've got miniature mansions. We've got really beautiful landscaping. But what people don't know is that was one of the first Black freed communities in Austin. It's where the first Black school was. It was where the first Black church, which is still operating. It's called Sweet Home Baptist Church. It was where the first Black-owned grocery store was, a thriving town right outside of sort of the main thoroughfare of Austin, Texas. And this is the first schoolhouse in Clarksville. And so here we are in the early 20th century. In the late 1800s, after emancipation, we have these thriving 6 freedmen towns. Wheatsville was another of them. If you're familiar with Wheatsville Co-op, that was just a grocery store that was actually named after this freedmen town. But Austin has always been divided, and that historical knowledge is really important to understanding where we are now. So this is a bird's eye view visual of what we used to call East Avenue Street. And so where these cars are coming down the street, that's East Avenue. It's what you now call I-35. And so regardless if you guys are from here, I'm sure you guys drove down I-35 or across I-35. It literally divides the city. And I don't think it would take much of an argument to say it's not just a division in terms of east to west, it's a division of haves and have-nots. And so in 1928, the city of Austin put together a city plan. Most of you guys, if you go back in your history of your city, most of these city plans were created in the early 20th century, sort of after Industrial Revolution, this idea of how can we put policy in place to make sure we're giving resources, they're being allocated in the proper ways in our cities. Well, Austin's city plan literally put racism to practice, right? So this is the city plan that was created by Couchman Fowler, and it was the idea of we're going to create a Negro district. So that area that I described earlier, Clarksville, was prime real estate. It was in central Austin, wasn't far from the Capitol. It's where a lot of wealthy people lived. In fact, the old governor's mansion, Pease Mansion, is still there. And why do you think you had the freedmen's town right next to this predominantly white, wealthy city? Well, it's like, well, we're gonna let you be free, but the land we're gonna give you is in proximity so you can still walk and work for us, right? And so a lot of people wanted this land. And so the city of Austin went to a lot of the folks in Clarksville and said, we'd love to buy this land from you. People were like, we're good, thank you for asking though. And the city was like, all right, well, we're gonna put together this city plan that makes it illegal for you to live in this area. And so they created the Negro District. And so they forcibly removed all people of color from the west part of Austin to east, what we now reference as East Austin, and said that if you don't move there, we're gonna cut off all access to city resources, so electricity, trash, other public services. So this is a quote from the 1928 city plan. Again, a foundational document in how we operate as a city. There has been considerable talk in Austin, as well as other cities, in regard to the race segregation problem. This problem cannot be solved legally under any zoning law known to us as present. Practically all attempts of such have been proven unconstitutional. In our studies in Austin, we have found that the Negroes are present in small numbers in practically all sections of the city, excepting the areas just east of East Avenue and south of City Cemetery. This area seems to be all Negro population. It is our recommendation that the nearest approach to the solution of the race segregation problem will be the recommendation of this district as a Negro district. This will eliminate the necessity of duplication of white and black schools, white and black parks, and other duplicate facilities. So when you think about, I don't know how you responded in hearing that read aloud or reading it on the screen, but hopefully there's sort of this visceral response that happens, right? This is language being put into a legal document. And so when you think about what that looks like 100 years later, 80 years later, and if that's the foundation of a city, right? This idea that we aren't created equal, we're not valued the same way within the law or otherwise, socially, culturally, politically, then what does that do around like the spirit of a community? And what is our role in sort of in coming against that spirit? So again, this is the continued segregation of Austin. The black population is in pink. As you can see, this is very narrowly defined section. This is the 1940s, and the rest of Austin is white Austin. So as you guys, if this is your first time visiting Austin, I'm sure unless you live, I don't know, not in America, you've heard all these things, right? We're the fastest growing city in the US, top greenest city in the US, live music capital of the world, most politically liberal city in Texas, top 10 college educated cities, right? All these wonderful things. I joked that there was one year where we were on so many top 10 lists. I was like, best toilet paper in America, like best place to eat a Dorito under a tree. I mean, it was just like ridiculous, right? This PR buzz around our city. And as someone who's from here, I didn't necessarily disagree with these facts, right? I was living here. I went to school far away, came back. There was clearly something about the city that I love, that I wanted to be a part of, right? But it's this convenient truth that we tell ourselves, right? That everything's okay, everything's copacetic. If I'm living great, everyone's living great. If people say we're liberal and progressive, then we must be liberal and progressive because we checked some box at the ballot. But not doing our due diligence as people who call ourselves those who are advocates, activists, pursuers of social justice, pursuers of what God's calling us to do, to really look under the surface of really what's just PR buzz, to have an understanding of the true context of the communities we're living in. And so here's a study that came out in 2010. Austin is the most economically segregated city in the country, right? So how do you have on one hand, we're top innovation, right? We got Dell, Facebook's moving here, Samsung's moving here, right? We think about who's getting those jobs, where are those resources going? We're the live music capital of the world, we do really well in patronizing our local businesses. Well, who's partaking in that wealth? Who's partaking in the opportunity to be a part of what we call one of the best cities in the country? And how can that live truly? How can those things live together if we're the most economically segregated? And if we dive just a little bit deeper, we realize that economic segregation is also racial segregation. So in essence, this is the ignored reality. Most economically segregated city in America. We're the fastest growing city in the US that is simultaneously losing its African American population. And we're one of the premier models of what gentrification and displacement looks like. So those of you who guys just did a tour of East Austin, right? It's a great part of the city. Well, newsflash, it's always been a great part of the city. And it didn't just come that when we built 27 breweries on one street and 85,000 overpriced coffee shops on another street, right? It's always been a dynamic, beautiful part of the city because the people that lived there created that vibrancy. They literally tilled the soil for it to be a place where the whole city benefits from, right? And so we do ourselves an injustice when we only tell part of the story. It doesn't allow us to do the work correctly. It doesn't allow us to do the work authentically. And most importantly, it ignores the literal blood, sweat, and tears of people who have lived in this oppressive narrative for decades. And now what you see, particularly in the context of gentrification and displacement, right? Gentrification innately is not a bad thing. It's the renewal of resources. It means resources are coming in, predominantly economic or sometimes infrastructure. But when it turns to displacement, whether that's physical displacement, right? So that's what we're seeing, this mass influx of Black and brown people moving real south to the city or really north of the city because they can't afford to live there anymore. Their property taxes have gone up. But there's also social cultural displacement, which means you moved in and you don't know anything about my family, my community's contributions to this city. And you don't care. You think the world started when we built these breweries and these coffee shops, and you've done nothing to connect with the community in which you now live. And so when we put those things at the forefront, we realize that perhaps we are living in this false narrative, right? We haven't done our work to make sure we're actually being a part of the reconciliation of our communities and our cities. This is just, a little bit more context. This Travis County is one of the major counties in the Austin surrounding areas. For those you heard from Pfluger, that's Williamson County. So what you're seeing are these statistics by race. This idea of poverty and chronic disease, so how the metrics that we use around health, right? And so all of these things are vital. So when we think about justice, it's not just this idea of race on this one layer. It's around economic vitality. It's around overall health, mental health, as well as physical health. It's around educational opportunity and access. It's around housing and affordability. These things cannot be separated. They're all interrelated. And when we think about people's quality of life, all those things matter. And I strongly believe that individual churches or congregations have particular visions or callings, but this is not a choice. This should be interconnected into the foundation of the work that you're doing. You don't get to choose, it's not an opt-in, right? I think people do criminal justice, and prison ministry really well. I think some people do homeless ministry really well, and that's fine. But this, regardless of the context, color of your congregation, should be in the fabric of your ministry. So unfortunately, an anonymous quote, but I think frames what I just shared. It's this idea, it is from this premise that we enter into a discourse about fractured human relationship, racial ethnic discord, and mistrust, the heartache of which drives us proverbial needs to implore of God to allow us, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer says, Christ to transcend our otherness, right? So we've created all these fractions, right? But the only thing that can help us transcend those things is Christ. So let's get comfortable with being uncomfortable, shall we, guys? So when I think about, this history, right? And this idea of having an understanding of your context, your cultural context, your political context, this work requires a paradigm shift. This isn't just a sickness or, in our community that's affecting Black people, brown people, right? We think of this idea of like, those are the oppressed, and I am the person with means, or we are the community with means, and we're gonna go in and fix it, right? There has to be this actual exchange that happens, which means putting yourself in a position where you don't necessarily get to come in and be comfortable. If there's truly a change of heart, if there's truly this opportunity of learning, then you should step away with this idea of like, you know what, that didn't necessarily feel comfortable, but now I have an understanding of that person's position, right? I use this really silly metaphor or visual, right? All of us had braces at some point. Maybe, possibly, okay, right? It's this really, we currently, right? It's uncomfortable, it's itchy, it's not pretty. I don't know, for some reason in 8th grade, I thought it was really cool, but we know it's not now, right? But that transformation, that going back to the orthodontist every however many weeks, and when he tightened it, it hurt, but then that meant your teeth were moving. That meant that there was a change happening, a shifting, a literal shifting happen. That's what it should feel like as we grow as a body, right? That there should be this literal shifting happen, which means we can't always be in the positions of comfort. And I think oftentimes we think of this work as like mission work, right? But even in mission work, we get to come in as the people with the means, right? We probably have slightly better accommodations, but we kind of present ourselves as like, oh my God, I roughed it out in like, you know, Argentina or Venezuela for like 3 weeks, and I only showered for so many, right? That's surface level uncomfortability, right? When we talk about true transformation, it should be, I've never been put in this position before, to maybe that means I have to be silent. Maybe I have to listen. Maybe I have to empathize, and it's really hard for me to empathize because that's not my experience. And also, I didn't think that was my understanding of the world and the way it should work, right? And empathizing beyond our own experience. I think oftentimes we limit empathy around like, I felt that way. Well, that's sympathy, right? Like I felt that before. But what happens when that person's experience, that community's experience, is nothing that you've ever even felt before? What does it look like to truly address that need, even if it means it's outside of your comfort zone, outside of your experience? So we're gonna do a little walkthrough, and I'm gonna pass these around now, of some, it's like summer school, of some terms, some language. Make sure I have, yep, just one copy per person, and it's a front back handout. I think it's just as important as it is to have context, right? Context is the story. It's important for us to have similar language that we speak so that when we do facilitate conversations with not just communities outside of the church, but our own communities, right? Because the work isn't just around soul work. It's around the work that people have to go and do every single day in their workplace, in their neighborhoods, around their children. And so some language that can hopefully help us to have a better understanding of how our unintended and intended, perhaps, microaggressions, biases come out in the world. And if we have a better understanding of the nuances of that, perhaps we can be a little bit more conscious of how we are operating in the world. So we're gonna start here with stereotype, right? Most of us know what this is, but I'm gonna go with some very specific definitions because there's nuances that I want you guys to get. So it's a simplified thought and labeling of an individual into a group that is characterized with certain attributes, positive or negative, with which individual is expected to support, right? So the stereotype that people with glasses are smarter. I assume that you guys are actually, but, or the stereotype, right, that people from Texas, you know what, I'm not gonna, y'all probably have your own stereotypes about people from Texas. What do you guys think of us? Right, that's a stereotype versus a prejudice, right? This is a specific difference. It's a value and feeling. A preconceived attitude, opinion, or feeling, usually negative, formed without adequate knowledge, thought, or reason, right? That is important to understand, right? Stereotypes can be, right? Stereotypes are the human's sort of short code, right? This is A, so therefore put in that box. I can quickly sort of, but prejudice is something that we carry within our hearts, our souls, our minds, based on typically no information or bad information, right? Maybe not even based on experience, just based on the space that we've been nurtured in and our preconceived notions of why this person would act this way, why this person looks this way. And we typically lump our prejudices within an understanding of community or geographical space. Yes?
So would you use bias and prejudice interchangeably? Where does bias?
So bias, prejudice is negative always, right, to have a prejudice. A bias can be something that is just your natural inclination, your natural desire, right? So I have a bias that I like red lipstick. right? That's not a prejudice. I don't have a prejudice against pink lipstick. It's just not for me. I like red lipstick. So a bias is something that you maybe don't have as much control over, as much as prejudice is an intentional understanding around a person or community. So discrimination, this is the action, right? So you can have a prejudice, but not necessarily physically or in action discriminate. So an action based on prejudice that results in unfair treatment of individuals or groups, unjust conditions in areas such as employment, housing, and education. And I want to kind of take a second and really focus on discrimination, right? So particularly given what we've seen politically, regardless of your political affiliation, we can all agree that this has been a tense 5 years, 3 years, 18 months, whatever it's been. And that we've seen elevated to the surface people's prejudice, a freeing sort of sense that people feel at liberty to just publicly display their prejudice, right? And what happens in spaces where we confront that or we have conversations around that is often this automatic defensiveness that happens, right? Because we automatically assume we're talking about individual, interpersonal isms or racism. So I'm not a racist. What are you talking about? I love Black people. I have a Black friend. I used to go to school with this Asian person. I'm not racist, right? Those are the things that go, even if you don't verbally say, those are things that happen through our head, right? But discrimination, we so often don't put ourselves in the position of understanding that it may not be around an intention, right? But because we haven't reflected on our isms, on our bias, our prejudices, we can be discriminatory without even knowing it. So think about in certain instances where you have put action to your prejudice, not knowing that that was a prejudice. And you might just think, well, no, I asked that person to join our small group or I asked that person to be in leadership because I thought they'd be more comfortable. Well, what's that comfort based on, right? Or no, we created this program in this way because we thought that X, Y, and Z, is X, Y, and Z. Are we unintentionally putting action to our prejudice? And we're not always the best people to know if we are. So that makes it important to make sure that you've created a context, a community, whether it's leadership or not, of people who can give insight into your practices. To say like, you know what, I don't think you can see that because that's not part of your experience, but what I want to tell you out of love is that this space that you've created is not equitable. It's not safe. It's not comfortable for us to be in. So that, I think, we sometimes think of discrimination as this blatant sort of action of racism, of homophobia, of sexism, right? But it can be subtle, but just as hurtful. Racism, a conscious or unconscious, intentional or unintentional enactment of racial power grounded in racial prejudice. The belief that race is a primary determinant of human traits, personality, intellect, morality, and other cultural and capacities that some races are innately superior to others, right? So sometimes we think of racism as like, oh, well, we've, presented some sort of verbal thought or this action that has harmed this person, right? But again, it can be subtle. And it's things that we don't always see for ourselves. So are we doing our due diligence to make sure we've created a culture of leadership where we can call each other out on it? Oppression. So this, I think, is really important because I think I've spoke to this idea of oppression in the context of Austin, right? When we think of oppression, we can think of it at the systematic level, right? There is racial oppression happening in certain workplaces, right? There's racial oppression happening in housing. There's economic oppression happening in the labor force. There is oppression in perhaps the way that women are not getting leadership roles, right? These are all forms of oppression. But oppression is around control. Right? Oppression isn't necessarily this idea of physical abuse or verbal abuse, but it is creating a system in which people do not have the same opportunity to matriculate, to gain power, to gain resources, to gain access. And what's important about oppression is we are all contributing to it, whether or not we want to admit it, whether or not we see it. I'm contributing to oppression every day. You're contributing to oppression every day. And I think our role in oppression is to start to see the ways in which we have the resources and power to start dismantling it, right? So it's about control, and then there's internal oppression, which I think is really important for us as leaders to figure out how we might be contributing to that as well. How are we reinforcing prejudice? How are we reinforcing the isms so that people start to believe these falsehoods about themselves? And similar on a macro level, what I just talked about as sort of the false narrative of Austin versus the reality of Austin, how are we maybe contributing to our own community's ignorance around oppression? Another important distinction, diversity versus inclusion. So this is a big part of the work that I do at the University of Texas, right? I don't focus so much on student and campus climate as much as I do community. So leveraging the resources of the university to address these conversations of access and equity. Well, I like to sort of use this analogy, right? Diversity is numbers. I walk into a room and I can say, cool, there's 5 people in a black shirt, 6 people in a white shirt, 3 people in a blue shirt, 2 people in a green shirt. That looks pretty diverse to me. We did a good job. Everyone, high five, pat on the back. We did diversity. We've done that. And that's often, I think, particularly in the context of America in the last 20 years, how we've measured success. Diversity numbers, metrics. Well, you're doing that in the church. Well, okay, cool. We've got a black person on staff and we got a Latino person running that program. Diversity. Diversity is the one step in a 3-part series. The second part is inclusion. So if I walk into that room of green shirts, blue shirts, red shirts, white shirts, but there's a station for food and it says, sorry, only green people can have this food. And this person says, well, blue and white look really good together, so those are the people that can dance at this party. Then we haven't done the job of inclusion. We haven't created a place where everyone has equal access, everyone has the opportunity to participate. And that's truly, I think, the work that we're at in this juncture of our, of sort of the trajectory of our communities here in the United States is, are we being inclusive, right? And what does that look like? What does inclusion look like? And how do we prepare ourselves? How do we create structures that we're being not only inviting people, but we're including people? And the reason why you've seen Austin not do well at the inclusion part is being demonstrated by the flight of people of color. So for a really long time as Austin, we said, well, we're not as diverse as Houston or Dallas. Let's attract. We're gonna do all these recruiting measures to go work at Dell. We're gonna do all these recruiting measures to come work for the, at the Capitol. We're gonna do all these recruiting measures to come work at ET. And 1 year, 2 years later, all that talent gone out of the city. Well, does anyone want to look at that? Maybe there's some rationale, reasons for it. Well, what happened when people were in those spaces? Was there opportunity for them to be in leadership? Was there opportunity for them to engage? Did they feel like they could even be their authentic selves? Did they feel like they were having to transform, assimilate to the culture presented to them by their churches? Right? What does it look like when we say, come all, but then we've done nothing to create a space that truly recognizes, honors, and values the cultural capital that people bring to those spaces? And then I wanted to talk about at the institutional level, right? So again, that's not interpersonal, but we're all participating in this institutionalized practices, which typically is policy related. It's, maybe it's not on paper, it's not legal, but it's around our practices. So 2 quotes I think kind of summarize this really well. The power to create an environment where racism is manifested in the subtle or direct subjugation of the subordinate ethnic groups through society's institutions. Racism becomes institutionalized when organizations and systems remain unconscious of issues related to race or more actively perpetuate and enforce a dominant racial perspective. So how are we nurturing this power dynamic where the historically underserved, the historically isolated and marginalized or even oppressed come into a space and we've done nothing to alleviate that position of theirs, but instead continue to create this top-down approach within our communities. And lastly, equity. So, out of the civil rights movement, the rah-rah chant was equality, right? We want equal schools. We want equal access to employment. We want equal healthcare opportunities, right? But to truly be transformed, to truly tilt that power dynamic, you have to have equity. And I think this snapshot, this little cartoon does such a great job of capturing that, right? Equality says you all get the same box. Well, I'm 6'5", and cool. Well, now well, I'm 5'3", so the same box is not going to work for me, right? Equity says you get exactly what you need to not only exist in this space, but succeed and thrive in this space. And so are we doing that within our institutions, within our organizations? Are we giving people what they need? Or have we created this approach which just says, well, it's the same thing for everyone? That's where transformation really happens. And cultural competency. So I think that is where we equip ourselves to have this institutional transformation. Are we ourselves culturally competent? And that goes back to what I talked about earlier around this idea of having an understanding of the cultural and historical narrative of our communities. And not just the macro community, but the individual communities we're trying to build relationships with, that we're inviting into our spaces. What does it mean to be culturally competent? It doesn't necessarily mean you can speak Spanish, you can speak Mandarin or Chinese, right? Those are great bonuses. But cultural competency just means that you can sit and exist in this person's world without having to take up space, without having to be the one in power, right? Cultural competency means I can sit side by side with people and have an actual exchange. Oftentimes I think we're in spaces and we think we're exchanging, but we're not. We're actually either the ones doing all the talking, or we're the ones sort of, not intentionally, but sort of exerting our own power, our own understandings, our own experiences. So it's cross-cultural skills, it's knowledge and respect, it's awareness of our own cultural worldview and biases, and then it's an attitude towards cultural differences. So despite our differences, despite our different understandings, right, how can we have an exchange that's built out of love and built out of respect? And I want to go back to here. This is not just within the context of race and culture. This is also politically, right? This cultural competency conversation is so important today because this idea of isolation, this idea of marginalization is not just happening in terms of people's cultural identity. It's happening in terms of people's political ideology, right? And, to be honest, if we were all just pursuing God's will, we would not be so caught up in those labels. But we're not being culturally competent if we can't stand to be in a room with someone and respectfully have an exchange because they voted one way or the other. So I want to sort of give you some ideas, some tools about how we go about equipping ourselves to be culturally competent, to have an understanding of how we can facilitate these maybe sometimes uncomfortable conversations. So one of the most powerful drivers of how race is described, citizenship is defined, and communities are constructed is quite simply the words we use, the stories we choose to tell, and the framework we use to document such narratives, right? So one of the projects that I just had the opportunity to do was write a book about the story of integration at the University of Texas, which is not just something that's relevant to the context of UT or even Austin or the state of Texas. It's a landmark sort of evolution in higher education across the country. One of the sort of impetus in integrating African Americans to UT was the lawsuit of Sweat versus Painter Heman Sweat to enter the law school at UT. And that actually preceded Brown versus Board, right? So it was at the Supreme Court level that kind of laid the foundation for all schools to be integrated across the US. And one of the things that was so instrumental in writing this book was getting an understanding that this wasn't just about writing another story. This was about, it was a healing process for the students that were part of this era of integration, who were traumatized during their time at UT, a place that said, here, come and get an education, but no other resources. You don't actually get to operate as an actual student. You can't live on campus. You can't participate in our extracurricular activities. You can't play in our sports teams, right? A traumatic experience. And what happens when we as institutions or we as organizations or we as communities don't tell the real story? We give ourselves an excuse to not do this work now. And so one of the things that was so great about this writing this book was that it could be used as this tool of reconciliation now. And what was indicative of the need of that was when we first did the groundwork research, I went to some of our main research spaces and kind of gave them some dates and some names of very prominent African American alum, thinking I'm gonna get boxes and boxes of materials back. And I was literally handed a vanilla folder about this thin. And the title, this is a premier research institution. The title of the folder was simply Negroes at UT. I was like, wow, it must have taken days to come up with that category. Like, who came up with this? And just a few pieces of loose leaf papers and photos, no dates, no names, just Negroes at UT, Negroes at UT. And that might just seem like, well, that's just a really bad filing, or we didn't have computers back then, so this idea of archiving is difficult. That is a true demonstration of an institution's value of a particular community and experience. That the due diligence, we have tens of, thousands of pieces of material around UT football history. We have tens of thousands of materials around the archiving of the brilliant research that has come from faculty members. That is indicative of how we value people, not only in our historical context, but our contemporary context. What have we done to honor and value people's stories? How are they reflected in the spaces that we're inviting them to? Not just in terms of pictures on the walls and names of particular buildings, but how are they reflected in the leadership? How are they reflected in the programming that we're doing? And so this book, we literally just had to do firsthand account oral documentation of interviewing alum and telling us about their experience, trying to get as much information from places that we could. And one of the things we realized is that it really helped us reconcile sort of political and social practices that we had put in place around diversity, inclusion, and equity in our current student context, right? So what happens when students of color walk around a campus like UT and they see Confederate statues, they see statues of people who in writing have said they never wanted their presence on campus? Like, that's trauma, an everyday trauma, right? What happens when no one that connects with your ethnic background has its name written on a building? Right? And so say what you want politically around the taking down of statues, which UT chose to do, and we put them where they belonged, which is in a museum, for us to acknowledge and accept that as our history, but we don't have to celebrate it. There's a big difference between acknowledging history and celebrating history, right? And if we say as an institution that we value the presence, existence, contributions, cultural capital of everyone, that should be reflected in the physical presence of our institution, as well as the social presence of our institution. And so I really want y'all to start thinking about, how have you created physical spaces that welcome people, that honor their presence, that recognize their stories, not just the stories of the people that help build the place that you're currently in. So, this, I think, is indicative of, this is not what it's supposed to say, but we'll move on with it anyway. So when we start to make these connections, right, of historical narrative and contemporary. So this picture on the left is from 1961 in Alabama. Poster reads, "Police brutality must go." This picture on the right is 2012 in Ferguson. "Stop injustice, stop police brutality." Right? And we put these visuals side by side. And what happens again when we have this false narrative, which says, we've progressed so much, you know, my grandmother couldn't do X, Y, Z, and I can, right? And we kind of go about our business, we go around sort of our everyday, not acknowledging not just the work we have to do, but the work we never did correctly, right? And that takes a lot of guts, of courage to say, guys, I know we've put in a lot of labor. I know it seems like we've progressed, but maybe we haven't done it as well as we should have. Maybe we haven't done it quite right. Maybe we can do it better. Maybe it means laboring a little bit more. Maybe it means being comfortable a little bit more than we were when we did that retreat 10 years ago to come up with this new policy agenda program. Maybe those 3 hours in a cabin wasn't enough time. Maybe this needs to be work we do every single day, 7 days a week, right? In order to truly break these systemic patterns. This is not moving like it should, but it's okay. We're going to roll with it, like I said. So as our country engages in important conversations around justice, civil liberties, and human rights, these not new but ever critical conversations mandate our attention, our empathy, our learning, and our continued understanding. And although we're decades removed from some of the movements that we recognize to being pivotal shifts in American history, like the suffrage movement or the March on Washington or the Immigration Act of 1965, we cannot ignore or fail to recognize that these historic tragedies are still a part of our current realities, such as growing Islamophobia, such as the deportation of millions of people that have helped build our communities, such as Black Lives Matter. These are all remnants of our past. And the historical narratives we choose to recognize, document, and curate often shape our institutional memory and set a precedent for an institution's values and priorities. And so rather than an attitude that says, I'll do this work if only I can do it in this way, I'll do this work as long as it doesn't contradict X, Y, and Z, may I suggest that we start by checking our own motivations. Let us check our agenda. Let us check our isms. Let us check our fears of difference, our fear of the unfamiliar, the fear of breaking habits, the fear of breaking ideological patterns or theological patterns. Let the calling on each of our lives bring about peace and draw us out of our comfort zones and into the work of reconciliation. So I often meditate on this 1957 address from Martin Luther King, and it was entitled "Conquering Self-Centeredness." And this is a part of my favorite quotes, but I'm going to read the whole thing. He says, "An individual has not started living fully until they can rise above the narrow confines of individualistic concerns to the broader concerns of humanity. Every person must decide at some point whether they will walk in the light of creative altruism or in the darkness of destructive selfishness. This is the judgment. Life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others?" And so I think because of this room, the nature of who we are, we're pastors, we're leaders in the church, we're like, well, I'm not selfish. Clearly, I'm not selfish. I am doing the Lord's work. But let's maybe reconstruct how we think about the word selfish, right? Maybe our selfishness is in the ways that we're willing to engage in this conversation, only within, certain small gatherings at church. Or maybe it's, and I'm not willing to have this conversation in other vocational spaces, right? Or maybe it's the way in which I'm willing to set aside my title and set aside my leadership and say, you know what, I'm not best equipped to facilitate this conversation. This may mean bringing in someone else, right? So thinking about what our selfishness actually looks like, because we all have it in us, even a little bit. And maybe that selfishness, maybe that inability to set aside our comforts, our understandings is actually what's impeding us from progressing at an individual level and as a community, at a community level. Maybe our unwillingness to position people, not necessarily above us, but in that particular space, is not allowing us to grow. So these are the 3 C's that I think can help us understand how we build a lens of equity, right? So I talked about the difference between equality and equity, and I think if we're truly gonna move forward on a micro and macro level, we have to start thinking about equity. So the first is context. We talked about that a little bit earlier, right? This idea of, do I have a real understanding of my context? Not just the physical church or congregation that I am, but the community that surrounds it. Maybe I know the history from the last 5 years, but do I know the history of the last 50 years? Right? Do I have an understanding of how my community is situated within the broader context of my city? Do I have an understanding of how the current economic climate may be presenting itself in a way that is influencing the people in my church in different ways? And am I prepared to address that in all the different ways it's needed? Heard someone say they're from San Francisco or Oakland, right? So Oakland is seeing a very similar sort of regression or gentrification as Austin, right? Out of San Francisco, people moving to Oakland, it's more affordable. Well, what is that looking like for the predominantly Black community that was thriving in Oakland but now being pushed out, right? Do you have an understanding of how that's affecting not only the people that happen to come to your church every Sunday, but what about the people that they serve on an everyday basis? Because it's not just about those individuals, it's about how we're equipping them to go about that work Monday through Friday. So that's context. The second is culture. What is the culture that we've created within the space we've been called to lead? Are we creating a culture that truly affirms, recognizes, and honors the contributions that everyone has? Or have we set a fixed understanding of how this community, how this church is going to operate? And if you don't fit in, you don't fit in. And thirdly, connection. How do we build those connections, right? How do we create authentic connection? Not just a diversity retreat that we do once a quarter or once a year, and then we say, cool, great, check that off the box. Are we building connection every day? What are we doing to do that? So those are the 3 things I think hopefully can provide a little bit of, not context, because that's one of the 3 C's, but what are these 3 buckets maybe can help you organize your thoughts and organize maybe your actions around this work. And then these are 3 questions that I would have you ask as you think about those 3 C's. What is the historical narrative of your organization, church, or community? What are the demographics of your organization, church, and community? And again, outside of race, right? Having an understanding of how everyone's identities are formed. And that goes beyond race. That goes around the resources, the financial resources they have at their disposal. The ways in which gender historically and contemporarily is being played out in those spaces, and their social politics. And you can define that however you want. I don't think it's just if I voted this way or voted that way. Maybe it's because I didn't vote at all, or maybe it's because I don't feel empowered to be civically engaged. God is saying that we need to recharge our batteries, and I'm just kidding. I think we'll be okay. So having said that, this idea of being comfortable with being uncomfortable. This is a quote, something that was shared in a press conference about a year ago, and hopefully you'll be a little surprised by who said it. So I came across this interview, and these were the words that were uttered. There has to be an uncomfortable element to the discourse in order for things to change. So you might be thinking this is some amazing civil rights leader, this thought leader, historian, activist, maybe a New York Times person penned this. But the beauty of this statement, I think, is that it comes from the lips of someone who has every advantage to remain siloed, set apart, and protected from the pain of our nation's most vulnerable. In fact, this was stated by Greg Popovich, who's the head coach of the San Antonio Spurs. And I will just be honest, I'm not a Spurs fan. I'm not afraid to say it. I know I'm from Central Texas, but Popovich has been winning my heart over. So I might include gray and black a little bit more in my wardrobe this year. But he's been very vocal. And if you guys know anything about basketball, know anything about Greg Popovich, he has this very humorous sort of demeanor in sort of the press. He one-word answers, like, why do you think you guys lost? And he's like, because we had less points than the other team. That's his humor, his shtick, which I think is hilarious. But the one way that he positioned himself to actually say something was around these conversations of social justice, right? A white male, more money than one person can spend in a lifetime, head coach of one of the most winning teams in NBA franchise history, right? He doesn't have to engage. He's privileged enough to remove himself not only from the conversation, but from the actual pain and oppression that people are feeling. But he inserted himself into what most people would say is pretty uncomfortable. National television, ESPN, and you're in a particular setting where owners are just supposed to care about W's and L's. But instead, he inserted himself into a conversation using his space, the resources at his disposal to say, this will not change unless as a nation, as an organization, Spurs, as a franchise, as the NBA, we aren't willing to have these uncomfortable conversations with our players and with the communities in which they live in. And for me, that was so indicative of what it mandates from each of us as individuals, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be within our sphere of expertise or necessarily what we think of when we think about our vocation, but it is definitely intricately aligned with all of us who say that we love God and that we're called to demonstrate his love in this world. So I leave you with this image. This is your comfort zone. This is where the magic happens, outside of the comfort zone. And these are questions that I would ask you guys to ponder. I think we have some small groups already set up. And those questions are actually on the handouts that I gave you guys. I'll just kind of read them. How might you recalibrate how you are approaching and equipping your church leaders and congregants to facilitate these conversations inside and outside the four walls? How is context informing your leadership decisions? How can you reshape the narrative of inclusion to build community or congregational equity? And as leaders, are you equipped with the stories of the marginalized and underserved in order to build community trust and shape culture? And so I think, like I said before, each of our congregations has an individual calling that I'm sure you guys are executing amazingly, but this is not a choice, right? If we're truly following what God is asking us to do as human beings, right? If we're truly connected to this idea of shalom, which is the peace about the work that we're doing, a peace in the community, then this has to become a priority and this has to become intentional. So I'm excited to join you guys in this work. So thank you.